Before Vin Diesel became the face of the long-running and lucrative franchise focused on fast cars and
Family. It's family. You got family.
he made an impression lurking in the shadows as interstellar convict Richard B. Riddick in the 2000 sci-fi thriller Pitch Black. But actually getting that movie made was almost harder than surviving an onslaught of hungry beasts on a desolate planet. Grab your goggles and take a look at what the f*** happened to this movie. Pitch Black began its life at production company Interscope as a script called Nightfall by Jim and Ken Wheat. The original pitch followed a group of unlucky space travelers stranded on a planet where an eclipse occurs, and then vicious ghosts emerge from the darkness to attack the visitors. However, neither the ghost idea nor the Wheat brothers made it to later drafts. Seeking to find the full potential of the killer concept, Interscope approached filmmaker David Twohy about the project. As a writer, Twohy's resume included movies like the Harrison Ford hit The Fugitive, the cult genre favorite Warlock, Ridley Scott's G.I. Jane, and, somewhat to his disappointment, Critters 2. Twohy had just come off the Charlie Sheen sci-fi thriller The Arrival, and while that movie was not a box office success, it demonstrated he was capable of handling aliens, special effects, and directing his own scripts. Interscope told him that if he could improve the Nightfall script to their satisfaction, he could direct it as well. Besides the title change, Twohy set about injecting more energy and intensity into the story, but mainly turned his focus to the characters. While he was influenced by Ridley Scott's classic Alien and its realistic characters dealing with an extraterrestrial terror, Twohy's approach was for the savage creatures to be the catalyst that reveals the inner nature of his characters. He also wanted to subvert audience expectations with the direction his characters go, like a stoic lawman who's actually a selfish addict, and a pilot perceived as a hero, but who had considered sacrificing her passengers in a crisis. And of course, there was the movie's now iconic anti-hero. The outlaw in the original Nightfall script was a secondary character, a female space barbarian named Krieg. Twohy brought the convict to the forefront and transformed them into Richard B. Riddick, a notorious killer who turns out to be the survivor's only salvation. For his rewrite, Twohy drew substantial inspiration from the 1953 French film The Wages of Fear, later remade as William Friedkin's troubled 1977 thriller Sorcerer, about desperate men hired to rapidly transport unstable explosives over dangerous terrain. Twohy adopted its elements of unpredictable characters, sweaty tension, and a looming deadline, and applied them to a science fiction setting. For casting, Twohy convinced the producers to stick with talented unknowns, both to restrict the budget and to keep audiences guessing who might live or die. Radha Mitchell landed the role of transport docking pilot Carolyn Fry. Cole Hauser, who had also auditioned to play Riddick, instead got the part of his nemesis, Johns, a bounty hunter and morphine junkie. Veteran character actor Keith David would play a Muslim imam on a pilgrimage with 3 young men, and the remaining cast was populated with Australian actors like Louis Fitzgerald and Farscape's Claudia Black. But even as he was already in Australia scouting locations and building sets, Twohy still had a major hole in his cast. While he mostly got his way casting relative unknowns, the investors wanted a popular actor in the role of Riddick. The producers had sent the script to none other than Steven Seagal, and the action star was interested in the role. However, Twohy was also well aware of Seagal's infamous reputation for being a nightmare to work with, and he unconditionally refused to cast him. The executives initially threatened that Twohy would have to use Seagal, or not make the movie at all, but the director would not budge. Ultimately, the producers relented, and even had a suggestion of their own: Vin Diesel. Interscope had been working with the then up-and-coming actor on a film project about his time as a bouncer at New York City nightclubs. Diesel had seen the Pitch Black script and taken a shine to the character of Riddick, and auditioned for the part. Twohy was not impressed with Diesel's cold reading, but he did think the actor had an edgy quality that suited the sly space felon, and he hoped Diesel's passion for the part would translate on screen. The rest, as they say, is history.
It ain't me you gotta worry about.
For the movie's lethal nocturnal predators, the filmmakers went to creature designer Patrick Tatopoulos, who had worked on Stargate, Independence Day, and the 1998 Godzilla. After several months of tweaking the designs for the large carnivores and small swarmers, they finally dialed in on a blind hammerhead style with echolocation emitters, and visual effects supervisor Peter Chang began figuring out how to create the monsters with CGI. To replicate the desolate environment of a stark alien world, the production went to the small Australian opal mining town of Coober Pedy, which featured 360 degrees of barren horizon and had previously provided the post-apocalyptic wastes of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. In order to avoid the region's unbearable summer heat and accompanying fly infestation, the movie would film in the middle of the Australian winter when it would be too cool for the insects to thrive and interfere with the production's outdoor shoot. However, filming in winter also meant a limit of 8 hours of sunlight each day, which was inconvenient and ironic for an alien planet with 3 blazing suns. When cameras started rolling, the location could best be described as uncooperative. Inconsistent and inexplicable weather produced severe thunder and lightning, 80-mile-an-hour winds, or driving rain on an almost daily basis, transforming what was meant to be an arid setting into an area caked with mud thick enough to strand production vehicles. Toohey described the environment as hostile to both the characters and the filmmakers. Just 2 weeks into the shoot, the extreme weather had already put the production a week behind schedule. The movie was filming on sacred Aboriginal ground, and although they had received proper approval, the filmmakers started to wonder if they had been cursed. Fearing he'd get dismissed from the movie for falling behind so drastically, Toohey said the hope of making great cinema suddenly took a back seat to just catching up, and the process quickly became exhausting 17-hour days for 6 days a week. He compared the experience to pushing a piano across a beach. The conditions were also miserable for the actors, who had to be coated with gel and spritzed with water to appear sweltering in the harsh environment, when in reality the average temperature was only in the 40s. Toohey constantly worried that the air would get cold enough to see the actors' breath, which wouldn't be very convincing for a purportedly scorching alien world. The isolation of the shooting location also took a toll on the cast and crew. As Cole Hauser said, "It's good for focus, but there's nothing out there but kangaroos, rocks, and dirt. It can get you a little demented." Things began to improve once the production shifted to a Queensland soundstage, where Toohey and the crew could control the environment. But even that presented its own set of challenges. Most of the cast members had not worked with blue screen before and found some difficulty adjusting to acting against nothing. Limitations of budget and space also necessitated some creative solutions, like using the title's convenient darkness to hide the nearby boundaries of the soundstage. Backlit cutouts and forced perspective helped create the illusion of a horizon deep in the distance, even though it was really just a few feet away. For the final gauntlet run, only a 100-foot stretch of rocky ravine was actually constructed, requiring the actors to dash through the same section over and over, while the filmmakers used every lighting trick and camera angle possible to make the canyon seem longer. But even as things seemed to be back on track, there was still yet another potential catastrophe casting a shadow over pitch black. The financing studio, Polygram Pictures, went bankrupt in the middle of shooting. Toohey continued filming without knowing each day whether he'd have money to finish, or even a studio to release the completed movie, and there was a dreaded discussion about going straight to video. Fortunately, Universal came to the rescue and picked up the movie for theatrical distribution. Besides his smooth head and brawny physique, Riddick's most notable trait is the eye shine that lets him see in the dark. But even that came with complications. The shimmering iris effect was accomplished with CGI for some scenes, but otherwise, Vin Diesel wore bulky prototype contact lenses, which he said felt like having hubcaps on his eyes. But they weren't just uncomfortable to wear. After the first day of shooting, nobody could get the lenses out of his eyes, and an optometrist from 3 hours away had to be flown out to the remote filming location to extract them. Despite the alarming incident, Diesel insisted on continuing to wear the lenses for the remainder of the shoot, demonstrating his commitment to the character and willingness to suffer for his art. Speaking of eyes, one of the movie's most squirm-inducing scenes did not involve the extraterrestrial monsters, but instead the moment where Johns injects morphine directly into his tear duct. Cole Hauser had learned of the method while talking with heroin addicts as part of his character research. He brought the suggestion to David Toohey, who decided to incorporate it, and Hauser performed the act himself, despite the producers wishing otherwise. One clever related detail you might have missed, Johns stores his morphine stash in red shotgun shells, while live rounds are blue. During the climactic scuffle with Riddick, Johns inadvertently loads a red morphine shell when he needs his weapon the most, becoming a victim of both the alien predator and his own addiction. To generate the movie's uniquely alien skies, Toohey and cinematographer David Egby used a risky process called bleach bypass, which involves altering the original camera negative during development to retain the silver nitrate in the film, creating a special scattered light and redistribution of color on the image. The process was generally not allowed by studios because it affected the original negatives and wasn't guaranteed to work, but the final effect helped give Pitch Black its distinct aesthetic. Toohey later joked that between the striking otherworldly sky, the monochromatic alien sonic sight, and Riddick's ultraviolet night vision, he nearly ran out of options on the visual spectrum. Another challenge the director had faced during filming was ego problems, because he had created a story with 3 leads, who were each convinced they were the main character. The original plan was for Riddick to perish at the end instead of Fry, but Toohey had wisely reconsidered that while filming. And sure enough, during the editing and test screening process, it became overwhelmingly clear that Riddick was the favorite. Toohey further pushed the character forward in editing, opening the movie with a new voiceover from Riddick, and essentially telling the story from his perspective. Pitch Black was released in theaters on February 18, 2000. The R-rated movie opened in 4th place with a decent $14 million, but positive reviews and word of mouth helped turn the movie into a modest sleeper success, ultimately ending its box office run with $53 million worldwide on a cost of $22 million. Then the movie became a massive hit on home video, and Riddick grew into a popular sci-fi character, even as Vin Diesel himself was becoming a household name, thanks to box office smashes The Fast and the Furious and XXX. Universal wanted more of the Riddick character, but not necessarily another contained sci-fi horror movie, so Toohey and Diesel reunited for The Chronicles of Riddick, which was significantly larger in scope and budget. It was accompanied by the animated side story Dark Fury and the video game prequel Escape from Butcher Bay, but the PG-13 rated 2004 movie was met with indifferent audiences and financial disappointment, barely grossing its $110 million production cost at the worldwide box office. It seemed like Riddick would go back in the shadows after that. But that was hardly the final appearance of our favorite Furian. When Universal approached Diesel about a cameo in the 2006 Fast and Furious sequel, Tokyo Drift, he agreed, on the condition the studio relinquish the Riddick rights to him. While the character was kept active with a second video game appearance, Diesel and Toohey toiled for several years on a 3rd movie, eventually returning Riddick to his roots in 2013 with another independently financed R-rated encounter with hostile alien critters. It's been more than 2 decades since Pitch Black first introduced the intergalactic badass and helped turn Vin Diesel into a major action star. And while all of his space adventures were difficult to make, given the tenacity of Diesel and filmmaker David Toohey, we should still expect more Chronicles of Riddick. Because there's one thing we know about the character.
Strong survival instinct.
In Hollywood, there's no greater risk than mounting a vanity project. I think you know the type. When a director or star achieves superstar status, they cannot resist the temptation to turn their pet project into a film, no matter how poorly conceived or uncommercial it may be. When a star gets that big, chances are they're going to find someone to fund their movie, with notable recent examples being John Travolta's terrible Battlefield Earth, Chris Pine's unwatchable Pool Man, or The Weeknd's recent flop, Hurry Up Tomorrow. Somewhat in that vein, but perhaps not as egregious, is the way star Vin Diesel, whenever his stardom hit a peak as opposed to the many valleys in his career, used the opportunity to try and make his favorite character, Riddick, into a household name.
Convert now, or fall forever.
To be fair, one can see why Vin Diesel might hold the character in high regard, with the original Pitch Black arguably the first true Vin Diesel vehicle. He'd been around for years before, having shown up in Saving Private Ryan and a few other movies, but in Pitch Black, we had all the Diesel trademarks, including the shaved head, the ripped physique, and the growled dialogue.
I'm just wondering if I don't need a bigger piece of bait.
Co-written and directed by David Toohey, who also had a writing credit on The Fugitive and had done the well-regarded sci-fi flick The Arrival, this low-budget science fiction movie wasn't originally meant to get much of a theatrical release, but it was championed by early internet film critics such as Harry Knowles and Huron JoBlo at a time when that was really kind of a big deal. The film was a surprise sleeper hit, earning close to $40 million domestically and paving the way for Vin Diesel to star in The Fast and the Furious. When that movie and its follow-up XXX proved to be major hits, Diesel, now minted as a megastar, opted not to make the Fast and Furious sequel, Too Fast, Too Furious. Instead, he convinced Universal Pictures, the Pitch Black right holders, and the Fast and Furious producers to greenlight a Pitch Black sequel that would be wildly ambitious compared to the original. The result was a movie that almost killed Vin Diesel's career, but still didn't dissuade him from returning to the character again and, yes, even again.
I bow to no man.
Now, one thing should be acknowledged. The Chronicles of Riddick isn't exactly a Pitch Black sequel. While it did have returning characters and callbacks, it was meant to connect with a wider fan base, which is why Universal Pictures upped the budget from the original's $23 million to one that would be well over $100 million. This was truly meant to be an event film. So why did the studio agree to all this? There are a few reasons. One was that at the time, Vin Diesel really looked like he was going to be the next megastar in the mold of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
You almost had me. You never had me. You never had your car.
Given how well The Fast and the Furious and XXX did, studios thought that Diesel was a generation-defining icon, as at the time, the movie star seemed to be on its decline, and right now, one could argue that the movie star barely even exists anymore.
I think it's a half gram heavy on the back end.
In this period, it seemed like Vin Diesel was one of the rare people that could just bring in an audience on the force of his personality and presence alone, and that's a rare thing. So you can see why they thought he had captured this X factor and everybody wanted to exploit it. They simply wanted to be in business with him and they'd let him do whatever he wanted, and it seemed that what Vin Diesel wanted to do was a fantasy film. But lucky for him, fantasy was all the rage at the box office at the time thanks to the mammoth success of the Lord of the Rings series.
You bow to no one.
Diesel, who really loved playing Dungeons & Dragons apparently, and his returning collaborator David Twohy pitched expanding Riddick's origins, giving him a mythical background that could span a whole franchise that they would call the Chronicles of Riddick. This was only meant to be the first in what would be at least a trilogy, and in this one, we learn that Riddick is the last descendant of the Furians,
Sister, they don't know what to do with just one of me.
a race of warriors killed off by the evil necromongers, whose leader, Colm Feore's Lord Marshal, is prophesied to die at the hands of a Furian. Thus, instead of the alien clone the original was, this was to be a universe-spanning epic packed to the gills with the kind of prestige actors you'd find in a legit fantasy movie, including Dame Judi Dench, Thandie Newton, and even a legit Lord of the Rings star, Karl Urban, who would play an antagonist. The premise is kind of like, let's be honest, Conan the Barbarian in space, right? Now, given the bigger budget and genre switch, the decision was made very early on to release this as a PG-13 movie and a summer tentpole to boot.
Fuck you!
With it getting a prime June release date. It seems ridiculous now, but Universal really seemed to think that audiences would catch Riddick fever and that it was going to become, I don't know, Vin Diesel's Terminator or something like that, with them even greenlighting a direct-to-video animated film called Dark Fury, which would fill in the gaps between this and Pitch Black. Twohy and Diesel also expected this to be a mega hit, as confidence has never really been something that Diesel was lacking.
It don't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning.
And it was planned to be the first in a Chronicles of Riddick trilogy. Suffice to say, none of this actually happened, but Chronicles of Riddick, and it needs to be said, is not actually a bad movie at all. Sure, it underwhelmed at the box office, but it's quite watchable even if you revisit it now. Financially, it did make more than twice what Pitch Black had made, but considering the hype and how much it cost, the $57 million gross was considered absolutely disastrous. And funny enough, it actually ended Vin Diesel's brief reign as a superstar, with his follow-up films all pretty much financial disasters.
Flawless.
He made one movie called Babylon AD, especially, that got really bad headlines and seemed to torpedo his career.
You need two things to live in this business, your balls and your word. You don't have either.
With him even losing his agents at one point. The only film that actually came out that was a hit was a Disney comedy he did called The Pacifier, but a lot of people viewed that as simply a one-off. He showed them, though, when he returned to the Fast and Furious franchise and arguably became bigger than he ever had been before. That said, once he was a movie star again, he tried to get another installment in the franchise made. Indeed, he did succeed somewhat with Riddick, which returned to the low-budget aesthetic of Pitch Black and actually turned a profit. While its $42 million domestic gross was kind of poor, it almost crossed the $100 million mark overseas and seemed to do a lot better than other fantasy movies that Vin Diesel got behind around that era, including The Last Witch Hunter and Bloodshot, which, to be fair, suffered from the fact that it came out in theaters the same week that everybody caught COVID-19 and, well, the pandemic started. So I guess we never really would know if that would have been a hit or not. So Riddick didn't do all that badly considering that the budget was kept under $40 million. In fact, a fourth film in the franchise, Riddick Furia, actually might have been filmed last year. You see, Diesel was posting a lot of photos on his Instagram showing that filming was actually underway, and it does have an IMDb entry and apparently was shot in 2024, but curiously there's very little information about it online, including who else is in the cast or whether or not it was actually completed. That said, it may be wrapped and we might be getting another Riddick movie in theaters pretty soon. And will the fourth time be the charm and finally make Riddick a thing? Only time will tell, but I'll say this. One can never count out Vin Diesel, that's for sure. And it's kind of interesting that he keeps coming back to the Riddick movies, seemingly at 10-year intervals, which is kind of cool. Who knows? Maybe when Diesel's in his 70s, or maybe when he's in his 80s, we'll still be getting Riddick movies. And who knows? At some point, one of them might actually turn out to be popular. Stranger things have happened. Enter Vin Diesel, aka Mark Vincent.
Hey, Dwayne.
In 1995, he wrote, directed, and starred in a short film called Multifacial, which was semi-autobiographical and caught the attention of a guy you might have heard of named Steven Spielberg. He followed it up with a feature film he also wrote and directed called Strays, which was a hit at the Sundance Film Festival, leading to Spielberg casting him in Saving Private Ryan. In it, he played an Italian-American soldier named Carpazzo, whose compassion for a child leads to his agonizing death at the hands of a German sniper. His unforgettable performance was noticed in a big way, as was his vocal role in The Iron Giant. In the year 2000, Diesel was on the rise, with him landing a solid dramatic role in Boiler Room, and then the lead in a low-budget sci-fi horror flick called Pitch Black, in which he played a memorable anti-hero named Riddick, which was championed by early internet film critics and became a sleeper hit in theaters. The studio that put the film out, Universal, cast him in a modestly as a star vehicle for Paul Walker, who was set to reunite on the movie with his Skulls director, Rob Cohen. Initially titled Resurrecting, the movie, which was a thinly veiled riff on Point Break, was retitled The Fast and the Furious, and, well, history was made.
It was you!
While Walker was the lead, it was Vin Diesel's character, Dominic Toretto, who proved to strike a chord with the young audience that turned the movie into one of the biggest hits of 2001. In fact, within weeks of The Fast and the Furious hitting theaters, it was obvious just how big of a star he was becoming, so Sony paid him a cool $10 million to star in the spy flick XXX, which was to reunite him with his Fast and Furious director, Rob Cohen. Written by Rich Wilkes, XXX was initially designed as a vehicle for Eric Bana, who turned the film down. The movie was designed as an answer to the James Bond franchise, whose star Pierce Brosnan was in the midst of a very successful run, even if his most recent outing, The World Is Not Enough, was deemed by some as a bit wonky, with the choice of Denise Richards as his leading lady an obvious ploy to connect to the youth market, which was largely ridiculed.
Now hold on a second.
XXX would reunite Diesel with much of his Fast and Furious team, including Cohen and producer Neil Moritz. In it, he would play Xander Cage, codename XXX, an extreme athlete drafted into service by the NSA to infiltrate a Russian terrorist group called Anarchy 99, who have obtained a deadly chemical weapon called Silent Night. Right from the first scene, you can see how the James Bond franchise was being targeted, with a tuxedoed spy, played by future Cobra Kai star Thomas Ian Griffith, being taken out due to the fact that he sticks out like a sore thumb at a Rammstein concert. Diesel's co-stars in the film would include Samuel L. Jackson as Augustus Givens, a scarred NSA operative. He was set to become the franchise's M, and indeed was the only one who showed up in all of the sequels. Australian actor Martin Zakos, who's since gone on to specialize playing Russian bad guys, including in movies like The Equalizer, would play the film's villain Yorgi, while Asia Argento would play Yelena, a Russian agent who's XXX's love interest. Sporting a hefty $88 million budget, which was about $50 million more than what the Fast and Furious cost, XXX was predicted to be the major hit of 2002. No expense was spared, with the Sony hype machine going into overdrive, with them even posting a XXX billboard in Los Angeles in August of 2001 before even a frame of the movie had been shot. Sony spared no expense in the making of the film, with ambitious stunt work that included motocross and base jumping, with the gimmick being that Cage's specialty was extreme sports.
I like anything fast enough to do something stupid in.
The shoot proved to be a chaotic one, as tragedy struck when a stuntman, Harry O'Connor, was killed filming a parasailing sequence. And years later, co-star Asia Argento would also accuse director Rob Cohen of drugging and raping her during the shoot, an allegation which the director has refuted. Given the studio's high hopes of the film during the summer of 2002, XXX, which was stylized as small x, capital X, small x, so that it didn't look like pornography, was a brand you could find everywhere. I vividly remember buying the 2-disc soundtrack album and finding a rub-on XXX tattoo included. Once I saw the movie, I threw out the tattoo. It opened to $44 million, and, well, financially successful. It wasn't quite the major hit that Sony anticipated. It made a solid amount of money, earning $142 million domestically, which is a good number, especially back in 2002. And it made a similar amount overseas, but it didn't strike the cultural zeitgeist in the way that the Fast and Furious did, even though it actually made more money. Many at the time dismissed it as bigger, but not necessarily better.
I'm untouchable.
It didn't launch the franchise Sony hoped for, with Diesel, who was getting a reputation for being somewhat difficult at the time, bailing on the sequel, XXX 2 State of the Union, which replaced him with Ice Cube as another agent, and proved to be a box office bomb. In fact, for a while, the movie seemed to have really cooled Diesel's ascendance as a major star, with his big-budget Chronicles of Riddick a pretty big flop, and many slammed him for opting out of the Fast and Furious sequel, Too Fast, Too Furious. Of course, Diesel would eventually return to the franchise, with it becoming the kind of stunt-driven, epic spy saga that, well, XXX was supposed to be. Diesel did try to restart the XXX franchise with XXX Return of Xander Cage, which was another solid if unspectacular hit. And he's promised that more Xander Cage is coming, but we'll see if that actually happens.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Yet, on an interesting side note, XXX did in fact play a part in the creative reboot that happened to the James Bond series in the mid-2000s. You see, Die Another Day hit theaters in the fall of 2002, and it was chock full of cartoonish, extreme action, which was believed to be a response to the fear that XXX would make them seem irrelevant. As such, you have Brosnan's 007 participating in terrible, over-the-top, extreme action sequences, which wound up being despised by fans, even if the film proved to be one of the highest-grossing 007 movies of all time. And ironically, its director, Lee Tamahori, would go on to direct the XXX sequel. The Bond producers, noting how far off base they'd gotten, and also noticing the impact of another super spy who proved to have a much bigger impact than Xander Cage, one Jason Bourne, decided a back-to-basics approach was needed, giving us the Daniel Craig era. So in a way, that's perhaps wound up being XXX's greatest big-screen legacy, and that without it, we may have never gotten Daniel Craig as James Bond. The summer of 2002 kicked off a whole new era in spy movies, but not in the way that Hollywood expected. You see, there were 3 spy movies coming out that year, and only one of them was predicted to be a hit. They were Ben Affleck's Jack Ryan flick, The Sum of All Fears, his pal Matt Damon's The Bourne Identity, and Vin Diesel's XXX. In fact, all 3 of them actually made money, but it was The Bourne Identity, which was notoriously delayed and a troubled production at the time, that ended up becoming a classic. The movie everyone expected to be a hit, XXX, did fine, making $142 million, which was a tidy sum for the summer of 2002, but given that it was expected to be the biggest hit of the year, Hollywood insiders considered the film something of a disappointment. While the end of the film promised that Xander Cage would return, by the time XXX State of the Union hit theaters 3 years later, Diesel had bailed on the series, being replaced by Ice Cube as a new XXX agent, Darius Stone. The film was a huge flop and as such should have spelled the end of the series. Yet, despite being killed off in a short film included with a reissue of the first film on DVD, Xander Cage would indeed return, even if it took a whole lot longer than anyone thought it would. So why did Vin Diesel return as Xander Cage a full 15 years after the first film? To understand why, one needs to look at what happened to Vin Diesel's career in the wake of the first movie. Famously, Diesel had declined to return for a sequel to his breakout hit, The Fast and the Furious. The film, Too Fast, Too Furious, went ahead with Paul Walker, and it was a respectable hit. However, Diesel had his own tentpole franchise movie planned, The Chronicles of Riddick, which would spin off his character from the horror hit Pitch Black into his own franchise. It was an insanely ambitious film, with it boasting a budget that was at least 4 times what the original cost, and swapping the genre to become much more of a fantasy film in the vein of Lord of the Rings. It wound up being an embarrassing flop for Diesel, and his career ended up in serious jeopardy not long afterward. With the exception of the Disney comedy The Pacifier, all of his follow-up films tanked at the box office, most notably the French-produced Babylon AD, which was a disaster. Unsurprisingly, it was at this moment that Diesel reconsidered his choice to drop out of the Fast and Furious franchise, reprising his role as Dominic Toretto in a cameo for Tokyo Drift. He was enticed back for Fast and Furious, which was the 4th film in the franchise and was to be a reunion of the original cast that, to the shock of many in the industry, was a major financial success, as the smart thinking at the time had been that it was too late and that the movie would flop. In fact, it was so big of a hit that Universal Pictures made the daring move to up the budget for the 5th film, Fast 5, and change it from an urban-set street racing film to a global heist franchise. The movie was an absolute smash, as were all the sequels, and suddenly, Vin Diesel was once again a superstar. With his new clout, Diesel was able to get another Pitch Black movie made, Riddick, but many believe the franchise that really should have been rebooted was XXX, as the Fast Saga had morphed into a spy franchise of its own. Perhaps a Diesel-led XXX sequel would give a rival studio a small taste of the massive grosses those movies were pulling down consistently. As such, the decision was made to resurrect Xander Cage, with the notion in the film being that rumors of his death had been greatly exaggerated. Originally produced by Sony, the rights were instead picked up by Paramount Pictures, with Vin Diesel himself also getting an ownership stake, who would give the film a relatively lavish budget, albeit not one that would be on par with the Fast Saga, to relaunch the franchise. By this point, Rob Cohen, who had directed the first film, was out of the picture, and instead DJ Caruso, who had helmed the pretty well-received Eagle Eye and Disturbia, and the not-so-well-received I Am Number 4, were brought in to direct. The film would be heavily inspired by the Fast Saga, with it being a team-based movie peppered with international stars, in the hopes that the movie would play well to an international audience who had made the Fast Saga a global phenomenon. Donnie Yen, the biggest star in Asia, was cast as Yang, himself a XXX agent who was set up as the movie's antagonist but later becomes a secondary hero/protagonist. Bollywood superstar Deepika Padukone would play Xander's love interest, yet another XXX agent who becomes part of his team, while Chinese rapper Chris Ru, Thai action film superstar Tony Jaa, and model Ruby Rose would fill out the team. You see, they went all out to kind of bring in that international audience. Meanwhile, Samuel L. Jackson would reprise his role from the previous films as Augustus Gibbons, while Toni Collette, Nina Dobrev, and Game of Thrones star Rory McGann would fill out the cast. The action would be notched up to Fast and Furious style levels, with the movie adopting a distinctly tongue-in-cheek approach, which is perfectly summed up in Xander's reintroduction to the franchise, where he land skis through a jungle. The film was so closely patterned on the Fast and Furious movies that they even hired the series composer Brian Tyler to score the film. Obviously, all involved really hoped that XXX would become a global franchise, with threads being left dangling throughout the movie, teasing a lot of sequels. Heck, they even brought back Ice Cube to make a cameo as Darius Stone, who saves the day in the finale with a line that I'm sure they all hoped would become the XXX version of "We're family. X takes care of its own." Here's where it gets kinda interesting. XXX, The Return of Xander Cage, was actually a gigantic flop in North America. It only made $44 million domestically, which is a disaster considering that the movie cost close to $100 million. By all accounts, XXX, The Return of Xander Cage should have been written off as a flop and would have been the end of the franchise, right? However, here's the thing. It was actually a huge blockbuster internationally, making a stunning $300 million. Clearly, the idea to go super international with the supporting cast was a good one, and in fact, I think a lot of foreign audiences maybe saw this movie being advertised and didn't even realize that it wasn't officially part of the Fast and Furious saga because they were so closely patterned after one another. As such, plans were put in motion to make yet another film, but so far, that movie hasn't happened. This is due in part, apparently, to Diesel's obligations to the Fast saga and the fact that the franchise's rights are apparently tied up in legal limbo. You see, despite the original being put out by Sony Pictures, they actually did not own the rights to the franchise. It was somewhat of an independent film with a studio called Revolution Films, which was run by Joe Roth, actually being the financiers. Eventually, that studio ended, and Roth brought in a Chinese company called the H Collective to co-finance the new film based on how huge of a hit XXX, The Return of Xander Cage had been in Asia. Sadly, that company suffered a serious round of financial setbacks and legal challenges, and the question over who actually owns the right to the franchise apparently is still very up in the air. Diesel himself apparently owns a chunk of it, but nobody really knows who is the one who has the rights to actually make the film. Had this not been an issue, we probably would have gotten a fifth XXX movie, as DJ Caruso was all aboard, and Diesel himself has teased up the fact that he's eager to continue with the franchise. However, many do believe that the moment might have passed, given the fact that the Fast Saga's popularity has been waning in recent years, and the question of them even making Fast X Part 2, which was teed up, seems to still be up in the air, with nobody really sure that it's actually going to get made after all. So if the Fast Saga is done, then it kind of stands to reason that the XXX saga might have had its day, right? There's also the fact that American movies are no longer the cash cows in Asia that they once were. In the end, perhaps Xander Cage's biggest foe has been time. That said, if you had asked me when XXX State of the Union had come out whether or not we'd ever get another XXX movie with Vin Diesel as Xander Cage, I would have told you, hell no. In fact, I was one of the people that was sure that Fast and Furious would actually flop when it came out back in 2009, and well, I was pretty wrong there. Here's the thing with Vin Diesel. You never really can count him out, even though it may look like his career is kind of over at the moment due to the fact that the Fast Saga seems to be kind of spinning out of control, and there have been a couple of allegations regarding his personal behavior.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Diesel has a way of coming back, and in fact, he just wrapped yet another Riddick movie. So, who knows, maybe we will get a fifth XXX movie. You never know, stranger things have happened.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.